Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it.
I don't accept the argument that atheism is the most rational response to the world as we see it. I think agnosticism is.
Here's the bitter pill for people like Mitchell. If we are duty-bound to remain undecided, if we're duty-bound to remain on the fence with respect to unfalsifiable propositions, well then we have to remain undecided on a whole host of ridiculous propositions, including Russell's teapot, including ghosts, magic, ghouls, goblins, wizardry. All of that stuff is unfalsifiable in the same way.
If you ever try to bullshit me like that again, I will rip off your arm.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to take a moment to make you aware of my Patreon, the link for which can be found in the description below. Sign up today for as little as £3 per month and you can gain access to a plethora of perks and extras, including downloadable audio-only and ad-free versions of my podcast that you can listen to on the go. You can also have your question answered in a monthly video, and better still, depending on which tier you choose, you could even sit down for a Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. All that is available and much, much more. All you got to do is click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and you're all very welcome to another episode of The Most Annoying Non-Religious People. Today's target needs no introduction. I'm referring, of course, to one David Mitchell, an incredibly popular talk show host, comedian, actor, and you name it. This guy is a world-class talent, and truth be told, I absolutely adore his work. I have spent many a night going down a YouTube rabbit hole or watching his shows and comedy and being absolutely regaled by it. And so I just want to say that off the bat. Just because I feature somebody in this series and allege that they are incredibly annoying doesn't mean that I don't like them. In fact, in this particular series, I very often have to address and critique people that I adore, and this episode is just the latest example of that. Why am I featuring Mr. Mitchell in this particular episode? Well, his comments on atheism leave a hell of a lot to be desired, but as per usual, dear listener, you can be the judge. Let's dive right in, and without further ado, look at his comments about atheism and atheists. Have a listen.
You know, I'm not personally annoyed by atheists, but a lot of people assume I'm an atheist and sort of draw no distinction between being an atheist and an agnostic. And there's a sort of, particularly among, you know, basically rational comedians like me, there's a lot of atheism going on. Yeah. And I don't accept the argument that atheism is the most rational response to the world as we see it. I think agnosticism is.
So the first thing you'll probably notice about this clip is that it's quite dated, and some of you may wish to critique me and say, you know, Magic Skeptic, what are you doing responding to a video that's so bloody old? In fact, this is a criticism that has been levied at my channel on more than one occasion, and to that I want to say this. It doesn't matter how old a clip is. If that clip is still in rotation, there are still people who are going to be influenced by it. It's still going to have some currency in the marketplace of ideas. And so it doesn't really matter how old something is, it still deserves a response. The second thing I'll say is that many people have commented on this clip. Fine, other YouTubers and skeptics and so forth. I'm not deluding myself into thinking that I can offer some new penetrating insight, but I'm pressingly aware that many of my own subscribers may not have seen this clip and may not be aware that there are in fact some very good responses to it. And so I wanted to make this video so that I could enlighten some of my very own subscribers. And even if you have seen this clip before and you've seen other YouTubers respond to it, this video of mine can still have utility, because perhaps my comments can merely serve as a refresher for how to counter the points that Mr. Mitchell is making in this video. With that particular potential criticism addressed, let's dive into his comments here. What is the problem with what Mr. Mitchell is saying here? And I think the problem resides in the definition of atheism that's operating beneath the surface here. He suggests that atheism is not the most rational response to the world as we see it. He thinks that agnosticism is. And he thinks this precisely because of the definition of atheism that's at play in his thinking. How do I know this? Well, thankfully, we have Mitchell himself to thank for this clarification, as he has written about this in his very own works. And I quote, "What I don't understand is why so many people, the religious and the irreligious alike, have swallowed the idea that atheism is the most rational conclusion to draw about humanity's position and state of grace. Even those who oppose atheism do so in terms of its being too rational, lacking imagination or faith. Just because there's no actual reason to believe in something doesn't mean it can't be there, they say. But atheism isn't the most rational approach. Agnosticism is. You can't know, so it's irrational to say that you do." An atheist or religious observant might counter that agnosticism, saying you don't know if there's a god or gods, isn't a conclusion at all. They'd have a point, but in that case, I say it's irrational to draw a conclusion. We don't know, and we can't know. And there you have it, dear listener. When Mr. Mitchell alleges that atheism is not the most rational conclusion, we now know what he means by this. He is suggesting that it's irrational to conclude that one knows there are no gods. And of course, I'm in violent agreement with Mr. Mitchell here. And yet, I featured him in this episode of The Most Annoying Non-Religious People. Why, oh why, would I feature an individual with whom I'm in violent agreement with? And therein lies the question. And of course, as per usual, dear listener, on the question of atheism, it is a matter of definition. You see, he defines atheists as those who not only believe there are no gods, but those who know there are no gods. And that is a rather extravagant position. How could one possibly claim to know that an unfalsifiable proposition is not true? I'll say that again. How could one possibly claim to know that an unfalsifiable position is not true? And of course, you can't know that. It's impossible to know that an unfalsifiable position has been falsified. That is the whole point of an unfalsifiable position. And so I think he's got atheists wrong here. Atheism cannot, in fact, it must not, I dare say, at risk of sounding like a prescriptivist, but I dare say that it must not be defined as the position of knowing there are no gods. You're quite right, Mr. Mitchell. If atheism is defined that way, it would be nonsense. It would be ridiculous, and that's not how I define atheism. As I've pointed out on the channel in the past, dear listener, atheists are merely those who are unconvinced in the existence of a god or gods. One does not have to claim with certainty that there are no gods in order to count as an atheist. But again, this is a matter of definitions. If atheism is defined as those who claim to know there are no gods, I'm sorry, dear listener, but I'm not an atheist. And this is the problem that's at play in Mr. Mitchell's thinking. You see, he has defined atheists as those who know there are no gods, a position that's, I dare say, impossible to hold. Some will say that they hold it, but I'm not convinced they can justify their case. So because he's leveled this definition at the foot of atheists, he has concluded that atheism is irrational. It's an irrational response to the question of God. And I think this is just entirely wrong-headed. The first thing he should have done here is ask the atheist community how they define themselves, rather than assume that atheists are merely people who claim to know there are no gods. Have a conversation, Mr. Mitchell. We're here to ask, and granted, there's a plethora of atheists in the world, and some of them may very well define themselves in the way that you've described, but most atheists I meet don't do that. Look at American Atheist. Google American Atheist and look at their website and look at how they define atheism, and you will see that it is more in line with my definition. In other words, this idea that we are merely unconvinced in the existence of God. Look at the atheist community of Austin. They define atheism in the same way. Look at Atheist Ireland.
It's not really that remarkable a worldview. You know, I think a lot of people think that atheism is much more extreme than it is, and a lot of people think that atheism is a claim of certainty, which it isn't for most atheists. It's a claim that based on applying reason to the currently best available evidence, we have concluded that it's more likely that there are no gods than there are gods. We've concluded that it's more likely that humans invented the idea of gods to explain things at a time that we didn't understand how the universe works, and that from generation to generation we learn more about how the universe operates naturally, and we never come across an instance where we once thought that we had a good natural explanation for something, but now we realise it was a god. And there are a lot of instances where we once thought that gods were the reason why things happened, and we now understand that there's a natural explanation. And that continual one-way traffic leads us to suggest that it's a safe assumption to believe, not with claims of certainty, but just on the balance of probability, that when we do find out the answers to the big things that we don't yet understand, such as the nature of consciousness, such as what happened before the Big Bang, such as how life started, we know how life evolved, we don't know how it started. It seems more likely than not that when we do find out those answers, that just like all the other answers we discovered, that there would be natural answers and that there would be no need to invoke supernatural explanations.
Atheists are merely people who reject the religious claim that there are gods. And so that's it. It's not irrational to reject the claim of somebody who's suggesting that a magical, all-powerful being is responsible for reality. That's not irrational at all. In fact, I would argue that that is the default position. And therein lies the problem, folks. Mr. Mitchell's definition of atheism defines atheism out of existence, because God, as he is presented in the Abrahamic faiths, is unfalsifiable. God is alleged to be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. And such a description makes God have the same characteristics as nothingness. Just think about it. Nothingness is spaceless. Nothingness is timeless. And nothingness is immaterial. Clearly, nothingness is composed of nothing, and so therefore it's immaterial, spaceless, and timeless. If God is going to be defined this way, it's impossible to say that one has proven that entity to be untrue, because that description means that it's impossible to interact with said entity. That description renders investigation impossible. And so if one is going to suggest that atheism is defined as the ability to prove that entity as non-existent, well, then you just defined atheism out of existence, and it's impossible to be an atheist. And so that is my problem with Mr. Mitchell's comments. He erects a definition of atheism that makes it impossible to rationally adopt atheism. But I'm not the first to notice that this is a problem. Enter the GOAT, Bertrand Russell, an incredibly influential atheist and scientist, logician, mathematician, whatever you want to call him. Suffice to say, this guy had brains to burn. It was Russell who noticed this problem with how people define atheism, and Russell addressed this with his now infamous teapot analogy. And I quote, "Many orthodox people speak as though it were the business of skeptics to disprove received dogmas rather than of dogmatists to prove them. This is, of course, a mistake. If I were to suggest that between the Earth and Mars there is a china teapot revolving about the Sun in an elliptical orbit, nobody would be able to disprove my assertion, provided I were careful to add that the teapot is too small to be revealed even by our most powerful telescopes. But if I were to go out and say that, since my assertion cannot be disproved, it is intolerable presumption on the part of human reason to doubt it, I should rightly be thought to be talking nonsense. If, however, the existence of such a teapot were affirmed in ancient books, taught as the sacred truth every Sunday, and instilled into the minds of children at school, hesitation to believe in its existence would become a mark of eccentricity and entitle the doubter to the attentions of the psychiatrist in an enlightened age or of the inquisitor in an earlier time." Yes! Oh, yes! How pleasurable it is to read the wisdom of such an amazing thinker. Thank you, Bertrand Russell, for bestowing upon humanity your riches, your intellect, the beauty of your articulacy, and the insight of your wisdom. This is incredible. And of course, Russell nails it here. And this does such a great job of addressing the problem with Mitchell's definition of atheism. You see, the problem is we have religious people who are asserting that their God exists. This God who, as I've already clarified, is unfalsifiable, spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. You cannot interact with that claim. You cannot disprove that claim. I would even argue that you cannot prove it either. This claim is impossible to verify. This claim is impossible to falsify. So, if you're going to define those who reject this claim as those who have to know that this thing doesn't exist, what you've done is set up a rigged game. You've produced an assertion and a claim that's unfalsifiable, and you've suggested that we all have to take it seriously in some sense, that we all have to remain agnostic, that we daren't suggest that this thing is nonsense simply because we cannot disprove it. Yet the very claim itself is impossible to disprove because it has been constructed such that it is unfalsifiable. This is precisely what Russell is driving at with his teapot. Please notice that in his brilliant analogy, Russell is careful to point out that the teapot is unfalsifiable because it is too small to be detected by our most powerful scientific instruments. You see the point he's making here? So must we now remain agnostic on the existence of this teapot? I think not. Isn't this teapot obviously nonsense? Isn't it obviously farcical? Isn't it obviously a joke? Must I remain agnostic on the existence of this teapot because it's unfalsifiable in its construction? Hogwash. Nonsense. And again, this is precisely the problem with David Mitchell's comments. He, by way of analogy using the teapot, has suggested that teapotism is an irrational response to the assertion that this unfalsifiable teapot exists, because we clearly can't know that it doesn't exist. Well, the reason we can't know that it doesn't exist, Mr. Mitchell, is because those who have constructed the teapot claim, in this case Russell, thank you Russell, have been very clever in constructing it. They've constructed the claim in such a manner that it's unfalsifiable, thereby rendering knowledge of its non-existence impossible. So you see, it is complete nonsense to suggest that we are all duty-bound to remain agnostic. Definitions aside, folks, I don't care whether you want to call me agnostic or atheist, so let's try and get away from the labels. What I'm saying is this. It is nonsense to suggest that I must remain undecided on the question of the teapot's existence. And likewise, it is nonsense to suggest that I must remain undecided on the question of God's existence. If your only response to that, Mr. Mitchell, is to say, well, you can't know that this God doesn't exist, again, and I'll say this to you, dear listener, if anybody ever says this to you, that you cannot know that this thing doesn't exist, please remind the person who says this that the only reason that's the case is because the claim, like Russell's teapot, has been constructed such that it is unfalsifiable. And if, and here's the bitter pill for people like Mitchell, if we are duty-bound to remain undecided, if we're duty-bound to remain on the fence with respect to unfalsifiable propositions, well, then we have to remain undecided on a whole host of ridiculous propositions, including Russell's teapot, including ghosts, magic, ghouls, goblins, wizardry. All of that stuff is unfalsifiable in the same way. I, in the past, have used the example of invisible pixies and leprechauns. How would you go about proving the non-existence of leprechauns? Again, it's unfalsifiable. If you're going to say, oh, well, we just haven't observed one thus far, well, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Absence of evidence doesn't mean that you have evidence of absence. That's the whole point with an unfalsifiable proposition. You cannot disprove it. Having not observed it thus far is not evidence of something's non-existence. That's in fact fallacious. It's called a black swan fallacy. I've never seen a black swan, therefore there mustn't be any. And of course you'd be wrong, because there are black swans. You're inability to observe it in the here and now or thus far does not necessarily constitute evidence of that thing's non-existence. And so we're in very, very precarious territory here. If we want to go down David Mitchell's road here, we're going to be duty-bound to remain undecided, or, given my usage, agnostic on a whole host of ridiculous propositions. And I would submit to you, dear listener, and I would submit to Mr. Mitchell, that that is too high a price to pay, epistemologically speaking. The truth is, it's totally reasonable to reject the claim that God exists until such time that theists provide evidence of the existence of that thing. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the default position on any existential claim is rejection until such time that that thing is proven to exist. This is why I don't believe that Russell's teapot exists, and I think I'm justified in maintaining that position. And I think Russell would agree. Russell wasn't suggesting that we have to take the existence of the teapot seriously. He was merely pointing out that if we have to take the existence of God seriously or remain undecided, well then by the same token we would have to take seriously and remain undecided on the question of the unfalsifiable teapot. The key point is, guys, that it's ridiculous to suggest that we cannot reject belief in God. And so when David Mitchell defines atheists the way he does, he's defining atheism out of existence. And he's forgetting, or perhaps he's simply unaware, that incredibly intelligent philosophers in the past, people like Bertrand Russell, have already answered this question. I don't think Mr. Mitchell fully appreciates the extent to which his epistemology opens the door to other ridiculous, unfalsifiable claims. And I do hold out hope that if he were made aware of this blind spot in his epistemology, he might actually change his mind. At least I would certainly hope that that would be the case. So before we move on to examine what he says next about atheism and atheists and the afterlife and so forth, let me just conclude by saying atheism should not, it ought not, in my opinion, be defined as those who know there are no gods. That is impossible so long as God is defined in the unfalsifiable way he is. And just to anticipate one potential criticism, there are many in my audience who will say that they can know with certainty that there is no God, because God, as he is presented in the Bible, is self-contradictory. And to that I'll say this. Perhaps what you're thinking about there, dear listener, is the triomni God. The God who's all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving. And to be fair, the triomni God is self-contradictory. If God is all-powerful, can he create a rock that's so heavy he can't lift it? Etc. Right? So there are, in fact, logical problems with the triomni God. But many modern theists don't define God that way. Many sophisticated theologians have long since abandoned the triomni God, and instead they allege that God is maximally powerful, maximally knowing, and maximally loving. And so in so doing, they escape the triomni contradictions. And so if that's what you're thinking, unfortunately, that doesn't get you to the knowledge that such an entity doesn't exist. I would still stand by the idea that we cannot know there are no gods, but I would simultaneously claim that such a position isn't necessary in order to be an atheist. But again, it depends on definitions. I would just hope that people like Mr. Mitchell would change the definition they're deploying, because what they're doing is defining atheism out of existence as far as I'm concerned. But worse still, they're opening the door to a cavalcade of other nonsense in the form of other unfalsifiable propositions that they're now going to have to take seriously and remain agnostic on, simply because those claims are unfalsifiable. But with all that said, let's move on to the next point.
And I also, I don't want there to be nothing.
No.
I'm not convinced there's something, but I do want there to be something. I want there to be an all-powerful, benevolent God. And I like that thought. And I was initially brought up with it, and now I'm not sure. Yeah. But I'm not ready to reject it.
I don't have much to offer in the way of commentary on this point. It's simply a matter of preference. I totally get it. I totally get why Mr. Mitchell here has a desire for there to be some kind of an afterlife. I totally get the desire for there to be some kind of a genuinely all-loving being who's going to take care of us when we die. I can see why that would be comforting. I myself was comforted by it when I was a theist. I think a lot of people fail to consider the ramifications of having an eternal afterlife, especially if it's the kind of afterlife that's articulated in the Abrahamic traditions. Remember, the Abrahamic traditions come coupled with this framework of judgment where some people are, depending on your interpretation of hell, are deleted out of reality, or alternatively, they're sent to a place of hellfire and torture forever. Thinking about that and reflecting on that, the afterlife doesn't sound too whimsical to me. I mean, what if I get there and my fiance doesn't, or vice versa? Am I really going to be joyous? Am I really going to spend eternity in jubilation and happiness and contentment if my fiance is burning in hell? And if I am joyous and happy despite that fact, am I really even myself? Has the knowledge of my fiance been deleted from my memory, or am I aware of it but incapable of expressing sadness about that fact, in which case I've been turned into a heavenly automaton? There are consequences here, not to mention the fact that this afterlife is allegedly eternal, and as far as I can tell, eternality is torture. And if it was impossible to become sick of this eternal heaven, well, then again, it would just raise the question, am I really myself, or have I been turned into a zombie of heaven? Have I been turned into a heavenly automaton? There are problems here.
But I'm not ready to reject it.
So much so that it doesn't sound very heavenly to me at all. It sounds quite torturous and hellish. Funny that the heaven option sounds like hell to me. I'd rather annihilation theory were true. If indeed Christianity is real, I'd rather annihilation theory be true and that I just be deleted out of existence. At least then I won't be conscious of the fact that I've been deleted. There will be no more suffering. I will retreat to nothingness, and that would be just fine. Am I the only one who feels that way? Jump into the comments below, dear listener, and tell me, does nothingness really frighten you? Because it doesn't frighten me. In fact, it just sounds awesome. Not to suggest that I'll be conscious to experience the nothingness. I will merely not exist. I will not exist. My consciousness will not exist anymore. If that is what awaits me at the end, assuming atheism is true, and that there is no heaven or afterlife, although that would just rule out divine options. Maybe there's some other non-divine option that I'm unaware of, but let's just assume that there is nothing. Am I the only one that's comforted by that? Let me know in the comments below. Or are you, a lot like David Mitchell appears to be here, frightened about the idea that there might in fact be nothing? Does that scare you? Does an eternal non-existence frighten you? Because it just sounds totally fine to me. It is the cessation of experience. So there could be no more suffering at all. Now, there'll be no more pleasure either, but no more suffering, no more anything. That doesn't sound frightening to me at all. But look, maybe I'm in a small minority there. Let me know in the comments below, dear listener, what you think on that matter. But with that acknowledged, let's move on to his next comment.
I'm suspicious of the disdain for people who find that a comfort in their lives, and the sort of desperation among some atheists to tear that comfort away from them.
Oh, we always and inevitably get to this point, don't we, dear listener? Yet another agnostic who believes that atheists are, to one extent or another, immoral for, as he puts it, tearing away people's faith.
Tear that comfort away from them.
But here, Mitchell is assuming that faith could only possibly be a comfort. But that's not the case. There are millions of people around the world who suffer as a consequence of their faith. Even though they might derive some utility from it, some comfort from it, it can also visit upon people's lives an immense amount of misery. I've used this example before, but it works. Imagine you're a member of the LGBTQ plus community living in silence and in the closet in a part of the world where to admit that you are a member of the LGBTQ plus community is to take your life into your own hands because of the religious oppression that exists in those parts of the world. In fact, the oppression might even be self-enforced. Somebody who has LGBTQ plus leanings, somebody whose nature is that of a homosexual, for example, may hate themselves because they were raised in an oppressive and authoritarian religious environment which has taught them that homosexuality is sinful and that it's wrong and that it's somehow an affront to God. The amount of misery and self-hatred and self-loathing that religiosity can visit upon an individual is, I dare say, incalculable. The amount of suffering, and that's just on the LGBTQ plus question, to say nothing of the rights of women in parts of the world where those rights, to use Mr. Mitchell's phraseology here, where those rights have been torn away from people as a consequence of religious prescriptions. The amount of oppression that religiosity visits upon people around the world, as I've already said, is incalculable. But here we have the oft-quoted assumption, and we hear it again in Mr. Mitchell's words here, that to tear away someone's faith is to tear away their comfort. Well, I submit to you, Mr. Mitchell, that tearing away somebody's faith or enlightening somebody about the falsehoods that they've been indoctrinated into believing could in fact be a liberation. It could in fact be a liberation. And there are countless examples where that would be the case. I'll share one more just for the sake of being thorough. The amount of people around the world who suffer from what's called religious trauma syndrome or fear of hell syndrome. People who go to sleep every night and wake up screaming because of their fear of going to hell for eternity, where their skin is going to burn off, grow back, burn off, grow back for eternity. Do you really think that faith is a comfort to these people, Mr. Mitchell? Or would it in fact be a liberation to inform them that their faith is hogwash? Now look, I'm going to extend an olive branch here. I grant you, Mr. Mitchell, that there are people who merely derive comfort from their faith. But if I'm going to extend that olive branch, you have to extend one in return, my friend, and acknowledge that there are some people who would be better off without their faith. In fact, there's a hell of a lot of people who would be better off without their faith, because it is precisely their faith that is immiserating them. It is precisely their faith that serves as shackles for many people. And I submit to you, Mr. Mitchell, and to you, dear listener, that helping somebody escape that indoctrination, helping somebody to escape that ideology, could in fact be the thing that makes them happy. It could be, as I've already said, a liberation.
I'm suspicious of the disdain for people who find that a comfort in their lives, and the sort of desperation among some atheists to tear that comfort away from them.
Yeah.
And the argument given for that is that religion has caused lots of killing and pain. And I dispute that, because so much killing and pain was done in the name of, communism or fascism. Humans have killed humans in the name of anything, and whether it's religious or political or whatever. Humans just like to kill each other.
Yeah.
And they'll use religion as an excuse, and they'll use politics as an excuse, and they'll use freedom as an excuse. But the idea that you take away one of the excuses that the killing will suddenly stop happening, I think is absurd. What you take away is the comfort that a lot of people have as they face the possibility of oblivion.
These final comments are just absolutely unbelievable to me. Absolutely unbelievable. What a straw man this is. I've never met an atheist who believes that if we rid the world of religion, that we would have ridded the world of all potential reasons to kill people.
But the idea that you take away one of the excuses that the killing will suddenly stop happening, I think is absurd.
Of course people are still going to kill each other. People are going to kill each other because people have affairs. People are going to kill each other because of lies and deception, and because people screw each other over. People are going to kill each other because they're going to go to the pub and get wasted, drinking far too much, and then they're going to break a bottle over somebody's head, and there's going to be blood and puking and glass and all the rest of it, right? Human beings are messy. Who would deny that? I've never met an atheist who would deny that. I've never met an atheist who said that the kills in the world, that homicides in the world are going to reduce to zero if we banish religion. What kind of an appalling straw man is that? That's not what any atheist is saying, Mr. Mitchell. Of course people have other reasons to kill each other. Nobody is denying that. All we're talking about as atheists is whether or not there's enough evidence to believe in the gods that have been proposed, and atheists arrive at the conclusion that no, there isn't enough evidence, so we don't believe. But if you want to talk about the atheist or secular movement more broadly, and why they might wish to liberate people and educate people and have them lose their faith, yes, religion can be a pretty corrosive social force. Religion can cause people to do terrible things. Here, Mr. Mitchell appears to be completely ignorant about the nature of ideas and how they motivate behavior. He seems to believe that if we ridded the world of all of the potential causes of violence, that somehow we'd still kill each other. I'm not convinced that that's true. I think ideas are what motivate behavior. People don't act for no reason. People don't just go out the front door of their house and kill somebody for no reason. There are reasons, and some reasons are quite motivational. I mean, just one example. If somebody was to harm one of my loved ones, that would give me a very strong motivation to be violent towards the person who's committing that harm. I wouldn't just find a reason to harm that random individual anyway. If anything, what I would accuse Mr. Mitchell here of is a very cynical attitude.
Humans have killed humans in the name of anything, and whether it's religious or political or whatever. Humans just like to kill each other.
He seems to believe that human beings are at their core just very violent, disgusting people who just want to kill each other, and they're just inserting a placeholder reason whenever they're doing so. But that just ignores all of the evidence of psychology. It ignores all of the evidence of how ideas motivate behavior. I mean, how blind is he here? Is it a surprise that people act on their ideas? If I tell a child that they're going to receive a beautiful gift at the end of the week, if they do X, the odds of that child doing X are going to go up because incentives exist, because people act out the ideas that are in their head. If you give a population of people a book that tells them that they're going to receive a great reward for doing X, and they believe that the claims of this book are true, we shouldn't be surprised when the amount of people who do X goes up. Again, this is just basic human psychology. But Mr. Mitchell here seems to throw all of that out the window, and he seems to believe that people just do things randomly and arbitrarily, and they just insert a placeholder reason to justify, in retrospect, why they did what they did. Do you really think, Mr. Mitchell, to take a controversial example, that the people who flew those planes into those buildings in New York, do you really think that they were just engaged in plane flying suicidal behavior, and that they merely, in retrospect or on the day, alleged that their particular Islamic beliefs were responsible? Do you really think that they would have just found another reason to fly those planes into the building? Or could it be the case, Mr. Mitchell, that these hijackers were motivated by a specific theology, which has within it a theology of martyrdom, which has within it the glorification of dying for one's faith, which has within it various instructions to seek out the non-believers and besiege them? Could it be the case that that collection of beliefs had an impact on those 16 men's behavior? Could that be the case? Or were they just engaged in that plane flying, crashing into building behavior that they were just going to search for a placeholder to justify after the fact had they survived, right? What kind of a moral analysis is this? What kind of a sociological or psychological analysis is this? Clearly, those 16 men were motivated by specific ideas. But Mr. Mitchell seems to think that these were just intrinsically violent men and they would have found another reason to fly a plane into a building at some point or another. No, Mr. Mitchell. What you're saying is an affront to everything we know about human psychology. What you're saying is an affront to everything we know about sociology and the power that ideas can have on human beings. This is just asinine. This is an appalling analysis of the world and what's going on. Ideas have consequences. Specific ideas have specific consequences, and ideas motivate behavior. These are not controversial conclusions, dear listener. And for Mr. Mitchell to just shrug all that off and suggest that people will just find any old reason to kill and that the reasons are just placeholders. This is just completely insane. To pretend that specific ideas don't have specific behavioral consequences is mystifying to me. Take the example of baptism in the Catholic Church. Do you think that it's merely arbitrary that when baptizing their babies, they pour water over the forehead of the child? Do you think that that behavior is just arbitrary and that human beings would have just found any old reason to pour a little bit of water over their child's head? Or could it be the case, I dare say, that this specific behavior is caused by a specific reading of the Catholic Catechism, which instructs its believers to do precisely this during a baptism? Specific instructions have specific behavioral consequences. Is that not obvious? But no, Mr. Mitchell's analysis is that this is just water pouring behavior, that people will just find any old reason to pour a little bit of water over their child's scalp, and that they've just inserted their theology as the placeholder explanation for why they've done this particular thing. Now, I've intentionally chosen an arguably neutral example of behavior here to make this point. Clearly, this specific behavior of pouring the water over the child's head is caused by the specific prescription that exists in the holy text. Now, if that specific prescription can lead to the baptism of billions of babies according to this exact prescription, if that causes a change and affects a change in the behavior of billions of parents and what exactly they do to their baby in that specific moment, if that has the behavioral influence, despite how neutral it is, what kind of an influence do you think stoning homosexuals has? What kind of an influence does St. Paul's ramblings on how women should remain silent in churches? What kind of an effect do you think that has? What kind of an effect do you think all of the absolutely abhorrent statements in the Bible have when that book is disseminated into Christian communities along the Bible Belt in the United States, for example? To pretend that these specific tenets of these religions don't have behavioral consequences on the population that this book is part of? Again, it's just moral lunacy. So when Mr. Mitchell concludes by saying that all atheists are doing is tearing away something that gives people comfort while they confront oblivion,
what you take away is the comfort that a lot of people have as they face the possibility of oblivion.
He's just appallingly wrong. As I've already said, helping somebody to see that their faith is hogwash could in fact be a liberation. Specific beliefs do have specific consequences, and the consequence for many people living in these Christian communities or Muslim communities or religious communities around the world, the consequence for many of these people, because of these specific tenets and specific ideas, the consequence is one of misery and suffering and oppression and self-loathing. And all I'm suggesting, dear listener, is that it could in fact be a liberation to help somebody escape their fate. Not in every case, I'll always extend that olive branch, but in many cases, it's got to be a liberation. And so in closing, all I'll say is this. It is appalling to suggest that religion merely confers comfort. And it is appalling to suggest that religious ideas don't influence and affect people's behavior. For him to suggest that humans will just find any old reason to carry out atrocities is nonsense. Specific ideas have behavioral and specific behavioral consequences. That is just the nature of human psychology. It is the nature of sociology and social forces. Ideas impact behavior. People aren't pouring water over their child's scalps because they're just engaged in water pouring behavior that they'll find any old reason to do. They're doing it because there's a specific tenet and a specific prescription in their religion. The specific tenets of these religions have behavioral consequences. And David Mitchell wants to shrug all of that off. And it's ridiculous. And he doesn't have a leg to stand on when he does so. And on that note, folks, I'm going to leave it there. Did you enjoy this video? Do you agree with my criticisms of David Mitchell? Did I get anything wrong? Do you have any constructive criticism to offer? If so, jump into the comments below and make me aware. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this particular video, particularly this one, because I'm a huge fan of David Mitchell. I hope that has shined through, dear listener. I wasn't intending on being mean-spirited. I wasn't trying to tear the guy down. I just think that he said some really silly stuff here, and so I would love to know your thoughts on this video. If you've been enjoying my content, and if you enjoyed this video more specifically, make sure you drop a like on it. That helps out the channel enormously, and it costs you nothing. If you want to take your support of the channel a step further, please consider becoming a patron today by jumping into the description box below, hitting the link to my Patreon page, and you can sign up there for as little as £3 per month, and depending on what tier you choose, you will gain access to a plethora of perks, bonuses, and extras. And in closing, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.